this is something I learned when I was probably about your age, and maybe you'd find it useful. I understood, I like to win arguments, and I had got a lot of positive attention for being smart and being verbal when I was a kid. And so I had a fair bit of, let's say, intellectual pride, which I doubt I've shaken completely. And I like to be able to win arguments, and I could usually win an argument if I set out to do so. And so I thought that if you won an argument, you were right. And certainly being married has disabused me of that notion, by the way. And and then I realized that I was often saying things just so that I would win arguments and be right. And then I also noticed that when I was doing that, I had a deep sense of falsehood and disquiet, right? And I felt that when I was really paying attention, I could see that doing that made me weak. It made me weak and defensive and prideful and narcissistic, all of those things. And then insistent that I was right and kind of totalitarian. And so then I started to listen to what I was saying and to feel it out. Now, I was reading Carl Rogers at the same time because I was starting to get interested in the clinical world, and he talked about the necessity of authenticity. He said if you paid enough attention, you could tell when you were, let's say, not being true to your core self, something like that. And for me, that manifested itself as a sense of weakness. And so I kind of learned to feel my way along. I always think about it as sort of trying to find, imagine you're walking across a giant swamp and there are stones under the surface, but you can't see them in the murky water. But you can feel them out. So you can feel where you could step. You could take the next step and find solid ground. And you can do that with your words. You can feel, and I think that's a test for the authenticity and the truth of the words, is that they're not prideful, they're not designed to win, they're designed to provide you with a firm foundation under your feet. And I think to some degree, well, I'm wondering, I suppose, to what degree that's how you know, for example, at PragerU, when you should hold your ground and say what you need to say.
Certainly. And it's interesting because I think I've managed to learn that, at least in the political sense, when it comes to the job that I do. But in a personal sense, I still struggle with exactly what you were talking about, sort of feeling the stones and recognizing things in yourself before the words come out of your mouth. So now politically, because I've gone through all of this back and forth and really having to contend with myself and with other people, now I'm fine and I'm calm, and I'll listen to a story and I'll have this idea of, well, let's wait to find more information. Even though something immediately wants to attack somebody else, let's wait and hear more. Whereas sometimes in my personal life, my turnaround on recognizing my defensiveness is about a 24-hour period, which my boyfriend is struggling with right now.
Right.
And
well, that's interesting. Like that's played itself out in our marriage. I would say, I'll talk about my wife momentarily. I would say that when we first got married, the turnaround for her was about 24 hours. And she's got that down to about 30 seconds now.
Yeah. And that's, I hope to be just like her.
well, if you practice that, and if you practice, and it is that that's humility, by the way, really. It's like, if you listen with humility, you're always listening with the idea that you're probably still pretty stupid, and maybe this person will say something that will make you slightly less stupid if you listen hard enough.
Right.
And that's such a gift, right? Because if you're stupid, you're going to run into a wall because of it at some point. And so if someone who's talking to you can tell you where you're stupid, well, what a deal for you. And the thing that's so interesting about that, too, is that you're way more likely to be told where you're stupid by someone who doesn't agree with you.
Yes, 100%. And it's interesting that when I meet people like protesters who have this very shallow depiction of myself and are telling me that I'm stupid or racist or all these things, for some reason, I treat this person who is so far removed from my life with far more compassion than if somebody who I care about is coming forward and saying, hey, you did this stupid thing. And I don't know if it's because the relationship that I have with the person that is deep and caring has a little bit more sting when criticism is given. And that's why I immediately jump to defense. Whereas with this person, it doesn't truly matter all that much what somebody on a college campus thinks. So it's something that I continue to struggle with, but I've turned a 2-week period of turnaround into a 24-hour one. So
okay, well
hopefully
that's pretty good. Well, it should. Like if you practice that diligently, you can get the turnaround really quick. You know, and that's really, we were talking about the religious front, you know, that's really confession and repentance, by the way. That's a compressed well, because the confession is, so first of all, you can think about it as recognition of sin. Okay, so what does sin mean? Technically, it means to miss the mark. So imagine that the religious transformation in its microstructure is something like admission of sin, which is, well, I missed the target. And then there's a confessional element to it, which is, well, here's how I missed the target. You know, I wasn't aiming at the right target, I wasn't careful enough, etc. And then there's the repentance, which is, well, I'd rather not do that again. And then the religious vision, at least on the Christian side, and it's not unique to Christianity, is that if you go through that process of recognition of sin and confession and repentance, then there's redemption. And that is, I really think that's the cycle of growth, right? I don't think you ever learn anything important without going through those 4 things. But it's a useful thing to know, because that's a place where the learning that you're undertaking and your explicit description of the learning and that religious system of ideation, that's a place where they dovetail.
Yeah, and I can imagine pride is the one thing that is standing as a barrier to all of those steps. Yeah. Yeah,
well, good. Well, that's a very astute observation, because the precondition for that cycle of transformation is humility. And, you know, there's my wife prays this Jesus prayer, and I'm going to mangle it because I don't know it that well, but it's something like, Jesus Christ, have mercy on my soul, a sinner. And the Orthodox Christians, some of them pray that continually. And you might say, well, what exactly are they doing? And the answer is, well, they're trying to remind themselves that they're stupid and fallible. And you might say, well, that sucks, because who wants to be reminded constantly that they're stupid and fallible? But if that makes you more attentive and more able to go through this cycle of transformation, because now you're attending to the places where you might be in error, then it's a facilitator of growth.
Yeah. I'm curious, did you ever struggle with pride getting in the way by virtue of having the job that you have? Because so many people are looking to you and taking in your words as very much right in this very dedicated fashion. Did that ever come as a barrier in your personal life with your own arguments?
Well, I think that I was fortunate, you know, in some sense, because I didn't become well known till I was pretty old. Like I was in my mid-50s, you know. And I'd been a professor at Harvard and at the University of Toronto for 20 years. And so I had a pretty good reputation among my students. And I had some practice at what that was like. And then I developed a bit of a media following in Ontario, and I got a bit of experience on the broader social landscape before things burst forward around me. Now, so I was older when this all happened, and that was helpful. But I also, as I indicated in our conversation, I started to sort a lot of this out when I was about your age, and I realized that I had a lot of intellectual pride, you know, and that's the problem with being smart, is that when you're smart, because you get a lot of positive attention for it, it's really easy to overvalue it, to confuse intelligence with virtue, and to confuse the fact that you're intelligent, let's say, with the idea that you're valuable and good. And that's dangerous, because it means that people who aren't as intelligent aren't as valuable and good, and that's not a very good conclusion to draw. But it also draws you in a prideful way. And like I said, I like to win arguments, and I always thought, well, if I won the argument, I was smarter and better. And I realized around your age that not only was that not true, like seriously not true, because just because someone can't formulate an argument doesn't mean they don't have a point. This is something you definitely learn when you're married. You know, because your partner might be upset with you and unable to articulate it, and you might be able to mount a pretty damn good defense, but they still might be right, and you should listen. So, because maybe they'll stop you from falling into a pit. But I also started to understand, too, that in that intellectual pride, well, the figure of Lucifer and Satan, Lucifer in particular, so he's a variant of the idea of what's satanic and evil. Lucifer is the morning star and the spirit of enlightenment. And Milton characterized Lucifer as God's highest angel gone most spectacularly wrong. And part of that's intellectual pride, a huge part of it. And there's a tremendous intellectual pride in the totalitarian impulse. And so I started to understand that to the degree that I was characterized by intellectual pride and capitalizing on, a talent that was given to me in some sense by God, let's say, by the transcendent, because I'm not responsible for my own intelligence, whatever it might be, right? That's just who I am. I didn't do that. I had no more to do with that in some sense than how tall I am. It's just how it is. And then I started to understand that being prideful in that manner was participating in the same process that led to totalitarian atrocity. And then that just scared the hell out of me, I hope. My house for years was covered with Soviet paintings, these realist paintings. And a lot of them featured Lenin and Marx and Trotsky, a lot of the real intellectual acolytes of the communist movement. And they were huge paintings. Some of them were 9 by 12. And literally my house was covered with them. And much to the chagrin of my wife to some degree, although she played along. But part of that was to remember, to remember how attractive these totalizing ideologies can be, how much of a temptation they are to pride, especially allied with something like compassion, and how unbelievably brutal and terrible that is. And so I try to have that in the back of my mind all the time. I want to step forward carefully. I don't want to fall prey to that intellectual or moral pride. And like I said, I'm old enough, so I think I can handle it. And then I would also say, I have a lot of people around me who keep me in check. I have good friends, many of whom have had incredibly successful careers, extremely intelligent people and capable and blunt. And if I deviate, some of them on the left and some of them on the right, and if I deviate, they phone me and say, I don't think you handled that very well. You should get your act together, and then we fight about it. I did a video with Greg Hurwitz and Jonathan Pajot about the tweets that got me banned, where we tried to delve into the utility and morality of my behavior. Twitter makes you impulsive, and I can be impulsive on Twitter. And so, I made some nasty comments on Twitter, and I spent a lot of time talking to my friends and my family about, was that straight and right, or was it prideful and impulsive? And, so I have lots of people around me who help. And then I'm hoping I'm terrified enough of where intellectual pride goes to keep my ego in check.
Sure. And there's also this element of being a person who thinks you're always trying to do the right thing, and trying to do the right thing is different from doing the right thing. And I've learned that very recently. And as far as having people who keep you in check, it's been majorly important for me as well. I mean, I've been with a man for a year who now, whenever I do something that is wrong or could even be misconstrued as wrong, he goes, "Hey, I saw that you did this thing." And having so much of your life being filmed, which I'm sure you're accustomed to, it's really something that you have to keep in mind, because one 30-second moment you've had, which would normally be seen by nobody, can be seen by millions, and you will be held to that belief or that statement for the rest of your life, whether or not that's a rightful thing to do or not, with the cancel culture that we're dealing with right now. So to have somebody there to say, you could have said it this way, or I know what you meant to say, but here's how it could have been done better, is just such an important thing to have for everybody.
Yeah. Well, there's advantages to that. I mean, I've been required, let's say, to temper my public behavior in a more civilized manner since I've been in the situation that you described. It is kind of useful to be called to be on your best behavior all the time like that. But it is definitely useful to have someone around who is watching you and helping you, modify your behavior so that you aren't being impulsive and prideful. Yeah, you're going to be in a rough situation, because you're really young, and you do have to, assuming that your career trajectory stays upward, which seems, reasonably probable barring catastrophe, you're really going to have to watch yourself constantly. And so that could be good, but it's not nothing to have to do that.
Yeah, I think the moments where I'll find the most pressure in it is probably when we're doing live shows because you never know what's going to come out of your mouth for the most part when you're live. And I have been known to be a very fast paced person, and that is helpful and hurtful in so many ways. But as far as meeting people, you spoke to something interesting. There are times where you meet people in your most uncomfortable moments in life. And there have been moments where I've been at the hospital seeing a loved one, and someone walks in and wants to say hi, or a nurse or something like that. And it's just so interesting to have to take that in and go, well, this is a moment, and you have to make this moment for this person, despite what's going on in your personal life. And there's something so powerful about having to do that as a person, not to, step out of the realm of humility, but it's very meditative to take on an uncomfortable moment and make it comfortable for somebody else. It's a very powerful thing to be able to do, and a skill that I hopefully have learned.
Yeah, right. Well, it'd be a good skill for everyone to learn, because the idea there is something like you are required to be good regardless of whatever tragedy happens to be unfolding in your life at the moment. And I think that's right. I mean, part of the reason that people are inclined not to be good, so they become resentful and bitter, is because terrible things have happened to them. And that's genuinely the case. Now, you can blow out of proportion something and find a reason for resentment, but lots of times people have been really hurt. And you might say, well, don't I have a reason to be resentful and bitter? And the answer is, bloody well right, you have a reason to be resentful and bitter. And it might be a good reason, but two things. First of all, that doesn't mean that you get to stop trying to be good. And second, it also doesn't mean that everybody who's had a rough time is now no longer good. Now, in my life, I've met lots of people because I was a clinician and a professor. And now, I met literally hundreds of thousands of people. But I learned at least 25 years ago that it's often the best people who've been through the worst things. Now, if you go through something terrible, it can really embitter you and take you out and make you malevolent. And you have your reasons. But I've met people who had lives so brutal that they're almost beyond imagining, who were so deep and good that it was literally a miracle to meet them. And I met a lot of people like that. I had people in my clinical practice who were because I had this one woman, she didn't have anything going for her. Like, her family was utterly insane. Her mother was a delusional alcoholic schizophrenic whose boyfriend was paranoid and used to torture her to death about being possessed, literally possessed. She was very intellectually impaired. She was overweight. She was unattractive. She dressed like a street person. She had a rough life, man, in every way. She'd been in a mental hospital inpatient ward for like years. And she came to me hypothetically because she was afraid of other people. She used to kind of walk up to people like this. She was so shy she couldn't even look at people. And it turned out that the real reason she came, this outpatient clinic that I was working at a place called the Douglas Hospital, she'd been in an inpatient ward. And man, the people in those inpatient wards, they were so devastated. They'd been there for like 30 years. These were people who hadn't been let back on the streets during deinstitutionalization. And so it was like Dante's Inferno walking through those wards, man. And One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest had nothing on that place, I tell you. And she had been in that ward, and she had a dog that she took care of, and she had this idea that she could take her dog out for a walk and that maybe she could take some of those inpatients out for a walk. And that's why she'd come to see me. So you had this woman whose life was, man, she was facing an impenetrable wall everywhere she looked, and yet her attitude was, I've met some people who had it worse than me, and maybe there's something I could do to help. It was stunning.
Yep.
And so
those type of people that you meet are so powerful.
Yeah, well, the fact that you're suffering doesn't justify your immorality. And that's, you're called upon to act nobly regardless of your catastrophe. And
not only is
that's
that
a good thing to learn.
Better for the world. Yeah, it's going to be better for the world around you, and it's going to be better for you. I mean, I don't know that this has been studied or anything, but feeling hatred and being super reactive or sensitive to things that have gone wrong in your life, I truly believe eats away at your body and mind as a person. And all the people that I've met who have been the most powerful in my life have had some of the worst things happen to them. and they approach people with a smile, and they are calm, and they are collected in some of the worst moments you could possibly imagine. And to be able to master that as a person, I think is probably one of the most powerful journeys that I will go on or anybody will go on in their life.
Well, it has been studied, I would say, to some degree. It depends on how far you can see the research extending. So here's an example. There is a trait, neuroticism, which is sensitivity to negative emotion. And that's anxiety and pain, let's say. And people differ in their sensitivity to those at baseline. One of the things that makes people more neurotic, so experience negative emotion, is self-consciousness. And so really what that means is, literally what it means is, the more you think about yourself, the more miserable you are. And so that's worth knowing. So if you're always wondering how the world's treating you, and if you're a victim, and if you're always concerned about your emotional state, you will be miserable, because those concerns are the same thing as being miserable. And so there's that bit of research that bears on this issue, but it's also the case that we know that if you take a stance in life that's predicated on the idea that what you're doing is voluntarily confronting a challenge, then that's completely different psychophysiologically, neurologically, pharmacologically. That's completely different from having a stress thrust upon you. So if you're an active contender, you're actually a different psychophysiological organism than you are if you're a passive recipient, even if it's the same level of challenge. And that'd be the difference between stress and challenge. That's clearly documented, all the way to the cellular level.
Okay, so sitting in the ice bath willingly is better than having ice water thrown at your face.
Well,
what I'm hearing.
In fact, they're not only different, they're opposites. So, and the ice bath idea is an interesting one. I mean, Wim Hof, who's the world's master at ice baths, he's been plunging himself into cold water for decades, and he is so resistant to cold and so in control of his autonomic nervous system that it's kind of miracle. And so, we actually don't know the limit here. So here, I'll tell you something on the religious front that's worth thinking about too, in relationship to this discussion. There's an idea that's deep in Western culture, insofar as Western culture is Christian, is that the world is founded on a sacrifice, right? And that's what the crucifix represents. And European towns were built around a church, and the church was built around an altar, and the altar was built around the idea of sacrifice. So the proper sacrifice is at the center of the community. That's what that idea means. Now, you might ask, well, what's the proper sacrifice? And the answer is something like the voluntary willingness to bear your cross. And then you might say, well, what is your cross? And the answer to that is, well, that's the catastrophe of your life, right? That's the fact you'll be betrayed, the fact that you're going to die, the fact that you're going to be in pain, the fact that your loved ones will see you suffer, the fact that the mob will come after you, the fact that criminals might be preferred to you, etc. It's all the potential catastrophes of your life. And then the sacrifice is the idea that you have to let your, what would you say? You have to let your narrow ego go enough so that you pick all that up voluntarily, all of that. And then that transforms it. And I think that's literally true. I think that's what all the psychological evidence points to, is that if you adopt a stance of voluntary challenge, even in relationship to tragedy and malevolence, that's the pathway to transcendence, truly.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting that you say that, because my mother, she struggles with borderline personality disorder. And in a lot of the therapy that she's underwent, they talk about this deep attachment to traumatic events, and not only the traumatic events of your own life, but of other people's lives. And her attachment to that is often from the perspective of being somebody outside of the traumatic event and bearing no responsibility or accountability. Now, whether that's the illness to blame or your own personal ability to contend with yourself, it truly does change your entire outlook on life. And it can be a very powerful thing to take accountability for actions that maybe had nothing to do with you.
Well, okay, so I've got a practical example of that might be helpful with your relationship. So, and maybe not, but maybe it'll be helpful to someone. So now and then when my wife get into an intractable battle, we'll both have that proclivity to want to be right. So you want to be right because you don't want your beliefs to fall apart, and you want to be right because then you don't have to go through the inconvenience of having to change. So you have your reasons for wanting to be right. The problem with that is you might not be right, and plus you have to live with this other person, and so you better sort out your differences. I don't think that's compromise, by the way. I think that's joint union in a higher vision. But one of the things we learn to do, if we could pull ourselves away from the fight, because you think things like, well, some of the time I'm wrong, but this time she's definitely in the wrong, and I'm going to make that point. And she feels the same way, and so then we come to loggerheads. We learn to leave each other and go into our separate rooms, and then to meditate for some period of time. And here's the meditation. It's like, okay, we're having this stupid argument. Definitely my wife is wrong this time, for sure. But there's some possibility that I've done something stupid sometime in the recent past, or maybe even in the distant past, that made this argument somewhat more likely, somewhat, even though she's mostly wrong. And so what's so interesting about that is if you sit and you ask yourself that, it's like, what did I do imperfectly to increase the probability of this event? You will absolutely get an answer. You'll get some little fantasy, some memory, some thought about something you did. And then if you go tell the person that, then it takes all that pride out of it. So she'll say, what she did wrong, and I'll say what I did wrong. And then we're both confronting the situation like stupid people who have something to learn instead of like intellectually prideful people who are definitely right. And then we can, so far, inevitably, we've been able to construct a joint vision out of the argument, that's better than either of our a priori positions. And that's also a hallmark of a healthy relationship. It's not like you meet in the middle or that you compromise. It's that you bring the conflict together. It's thesis, antithesis, synthesis, essentially. You bring the conflict together, and you bring your two viewpoints together, and you meld a third viewpoint that's better than either of the viewpoints you brought to bear on the problem. And you can generally do that, and having that humility that enables you to examine what stupid thing you did to muck up the relationship. You can meditate on that pretty much forever, right? What stupid thing did you do to muck things up? That's an inexhaustible treasure trove of wisdom, that is.
Right. And one of the worst and most uncomfortable things that we'll have to go through in our life, too. So it's yet another challenge to face in full force, and something I will admittedly say I struggle with.
Well, here's something I learned as a therapist. This is also useful to know. It's not surprising that people shy away from conflict, especially if they're agreeable and somewhat neurotic, because you don't want to have conflict with someone if you're agreeable, and if you're higher in neuroticism, it makes you pretty upset. So you have your reasons not to want to have the discussion. But here's the rub, man, and this is something I learned as a therapist. Conflict delayed is conflict multiplied. Like if you have a problem with you or with your partner, then if you don't sort it out, then you're going to have that bloody problem for the rest of your life. And
absolutely,
maybe it'll be a problem that comes up every week. So that's like 50 times a year, and you're married for 30 years. So you're going to have that problem 1,500 times. 1,500 times. And maybe it'll take an hour per time. So that's 1,500 hours. And so that's 30 work weeks. That's basically a year of work of your life. That's like 2% of your life. So then you think, well, should I have a fight? And the answer is, damn right. Right now, man, 4 hours. Let's hash this out, right? Let's figure out how we're stupid. And then let's figure out how we can not do this again, right? And that we're both buy into, right? Because you have to both buy into it. It has to be voluntary. But you see, so you have that fear of not being right, and you have the fear maybe of having the fight, and you have the fear of discovering what's wrong with you. And fine, those are all valid fears. But you need to balance that against the fear of having the same fight 1,500 times. Yeah, that's not good.
Yeah, even worse is just remaining silent and never making that person aware of the problem that you have. I mean, what a disservice to whoever you're in a relationship with for them to remain ignorant to something that you are having such trouble with. It's just a really difficult thing to do, but it must be done.
Yeah, well, it is kind of polite to, one of the things I often hear people say, couples used to say this to each other, because now and then I had couples in my therapy session. I was always concentrating on a particular individual, but sometimes it was useful to have their partner in. People would often say something when they were talking to their partner like, well, if you loved me, you'd know what I wanted. It's like, well, sometimes that's true, and you're not just paying attention, but, first of all, you don't even know what you want. So how the hell would you expect someone else to know? And maybe you could be polite enough to let them in on the secret. That'd be kind of nice. Now, you have to make yourself vulnerable, right? Well, here's the problem with that. If you let me know what you want and need, then I can manipulate you and I can deny that to you, right? See, if I don't know what you want and need, then if I'm going to torture you, it's kind of hit or miss. But if you let me in on the secret, then I know where you're vulnerable and I can really misuse that. And so you have to trust someone to let them know what you want and need. You really have to trust them. And then you might say, well, that's naive to trust like that. But it's not unless you're naive. Once you're past being naive, that sort of trust is courage, not naivety. It's like, I know you could hurt me. I know it. Especially if I tell you this. But I'm going to do it anyways. Because that's an invitation to the best in you. Right? And then maybe we could sort out this problem. And maybe, you'll have the same luxury with me. You'll be able to tell me something that you need and want. And so
Absolutely.
That's the sort of trust you have to have in a relationship in order for it to progress properly.
And if you don't, I mean, what is your relationship? Who is the person dating if they don't know you, if they don't know your wants and needs? I mean, so often people reach out to me on the political end of the spectrum and say, I'm so scared to come to my friends and tell them that I agree with some of the things that you say. And I'm sure you run into this a lot. But to that, you just say, well, what friends are they if they don't know you and they don't know how you think and feel about certain things? And what are you truly giving people in this relationship? And what are they getting from you in this relationship if they don't know who you are?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, if you're in the grip of an ideology and you're falsifying your own experience to be an agent of that ideology, then it's the ideology that has your life and not you.
Right.
And that really is a form of possession. It's like you don't get to say what you want to say. You don't get to feel what you need to feel. The friends you have don't know who you are. They're not really your friends. They're allies. They're ideological allies. They're really comrades, in some real sense.
Yeah.
And it's a lot better to have friends than comrades by any stretch of the imagination. So.
Absolutely.
All right, well, we're out of time. That went by very quickly. And so I'd like to thank all of you who are watching and listening for doing exactly that, and hope you found, especially you young people who might be listening, hope you found this discussion useful in guiding you through the swamps of your philosophical journey.